for them, this is a disaster because, they could have hoped this would have gone on for a long time. They could have hoped that the oil price would spike. They may have deep down wanted the Iranians to block the Straits of Hormuz. That would have been an ideal outcome for them because that would have given their war economy some respite. That's not happened. So as a result, they're back where they were, which is a diminishing sort of economy, a diminishing fund with which they can actually fund their economy with. And there are big questions about what, if the Ukraine war keeps on dragging on, whether the Russians can actually afford to fight it for too long.
Hello and welcome to the Putin Files. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Dr Alan Mendoza, the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society and an expert on Russia and Iran. Dr Mendoza, thank you very much for joining me today.
Hello, Louis.
Well, in the last few days, we've of course seen this dramatic 12-day war, as it were, between Iran and Israel. During that time, Russia has pretty clearly sided with Iran and said they now want to deepen their alliance. What's the significance of that in your mind?
So, look, I think we always knew that Vladimir Putin would be on Iran's side because they've had a very deepening relationship over the past few years. It's notable, for example, that, of course, Iran has supplied drone technology to Russia. Some of the drones being used in Ukraine are, of course, Iranian drones. And, we've seen how, if you like, the axis of resistance, as they like to be known, have been working together on a repeated basis since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I don't think it's really come as anyone's surprise that Russia has ended up on Iran's side in this conflict. And, the only real question is what the importance of that is and whether it's actually a real thing as opposed to just rhetorical.
Well, indeed. I mean, that is the question. There hasn't been much physical support or even that much done on the world stage to kind of show a huge amount of vocal support for Iran. Do you think Iran will be feeling there's a slightly unequal partnership here between itself and Russia?
If I was Iran, I would absolutely be feeling that because, having supplied the Russians with, frontline equipment, basically things that were used in the war, there's been no evidence of sort of Russian resupply of Iran in any way, shape or form. And of course, Russia was responsible for much of Iran's, air defense equipment, and that's proven to be rather ineffective. So, you're looking at that as a military power going, well, what have you actually given me? Air defenses that don't do anything, and not much in the way of diplomatic support. You haven't, threatened to step in or do anything like that. So, yes, I think this sort of exposes the reality that although there's a sense that these powers are working together, the practical implications of that are very limited. And actually, it's more about, kind of all talk and frankly, no follow through in terms of what that means.
And so do you think this could put Iran's support for Russia at risk? And does Russia care that much? I mean, we know that a lot of the drones, especially that Russia has relied on from Iran, are now produced domestically.
Yes, I mean, I think obviously Russia does care about Iran in the sense that Iran is a thorn in the side of America in particular. And, that's good for the Russians from the perspective of you looking globally at a strategy. You want to have as many people causing problems for your main adversary, to use the Cold War terminology. And, Iran fulfills that path. And equally, the conflict in Iran and Iran's actions often draw attention away from what Russia's doing in Ukraine. So I don't think the Russians would like to see, the regime fall. And I think they, would hope that this ceasefire that's currently been agreed will last, and therefore Iran can continue to be a spoiler. But yes, it doesn't have a practical effect for the Russians now that they are already developing their own, domestic drones to such an extent they don't really need the Iranian equipment anymore. So part of this is really more about a moral ally as opposed to a practical ally.
And is a moral ally particularly useful for Iran at the moment, do you think?
Well, for Iran, a moral ally would be very useful, of course, because Iran is very isolated. In the region, Iran is totally isolated. The Gulf states have basically cheered from the sidelines, although pretending they haven't, but they're all there. A lot of Iran's former captive regimes like Syria and Lebanon have broken out in recent months, so they're not on Iran's side. Jordan's not on Iran's side. Egypt's not on Iran's side. So you're looking a bit isolated domestically in that way. And so Iran, does need an embrace from somebody, and Russia is a good moral ally in that regard. Although obviously I think they'd prefer now to look at the practical way that Russia might be able to resupply them. There obviously has been a bit of argy-bargy about that, with former President Medvedev suggesting even that nuclear warheads might be on the table before he had to walk that back after criticism from the US. And although we've not seen any formal evidence that the Iranians have reached out to Russia to say, please resupply us, we have to assume that that's what they're asking. And it'll be very interesting to see if Russia actually does have the capacity to give them things, given it's also engaged in its own problems in Ukraine.
And Russia used to tread somewhat of a finer line in this conflict. There are a lot of Russians in Israel, and they used to want to try and keep a slightly warmer relationship with the Israeli government. Is that over now as a ideology of the Russians on the world stage?
Well, I think the Russians are fully aware that the Israelis are more in the American camp and will always be more in the American camp. So from that perspective, what can you really do? Whereas Iranians are most firmly not in the American camp. So if you're going to have to choose sides between the two, you're going to pick Iran in that way, particularly if you are looking to cause trouble for America. And while in the past the line was more carefully drawn, the corollary of that was that Iran had regimes like Syria and Lebanon on Israel's border, where there were benefits to coordination, frankly, between the Israelis and the Russians over what was going on in those countries, because the Israelis, of course, had need to strike within those countries to block out Iran's terrorist cells, and Russia didn't mind that, I don't think. And part of this, by the way, is, of course, that the Russians had no particular objection to Hezbollah being, kind of overthrown, because, they regarded, Iran's attempts to interfere in those countries as rather counterproductive to what they were trying to do. So that, there's sort of been a strange bit of rivalry between the two. And the Russians tread careful lines everywhere, in them. And they're not signed up solely to Iran's cause. A good example, and very random example, is that Iran has for many years contested various islands in the Straits of Hormuz with the UAE. And actually, fairly recently, the Russians came out on the UAE side of the debate, and which caused the Iranians to critique them. So it's not it's a complicated one, because Russia will look to balance its interest in where it can do so. I think it's recognised that Israel is now, for it a lost cause, is not interested in that anymore. But certainly with the Gulf states, there is a lot of interest with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with others. And so Iran is going to sometimes be a make-weight in deals with those countries.
And you've mentioned Syria a bit there. I mean, things tend to move fast on the world stage, but it's not that long ago that we saw the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, and Russia losing that pretty important ally in the region. I mean, is this part of a wider issue of Russia really losing its foothold in the Middle East?
Yes, absolutely. And this is why, the Russians will be consumed with, pangs of worry about what this actually means. They've lost Syria. They've, lost some of the other influence they've had in different places in the region previously, people like Gaddafi and co obviously having gone. So you're starting to see a diminution of Russia's ability to interfere and get its way in the Middle East. And were the Iranian regime to fall, there's no doubt that the biggest international loser would be Russia, because Russia once again will lose that sort of irritant to regional stability that Iran is, and the irritant to the US that Iran is. And, in fact, arguably the whole regime, the whole Middle East will be transformed if the Iranian regime goes, and not to Russia's benefit. Russia benefits from chaos. It benefits from, disputes, wars, terrorism, and that sort of setup. Those things would all go if the Iranian regime changed. And so it really is very much not in Russia's strategic interest to see a regime change in Iran. And they'll be doing their best to try and keep Iran head above water, this regime, in the coming weeks and months.
And Putin, while this conflict was still going on between Israel and Iran, offered to mediate talks between those two nations. Has that helped to insert Russia back into this conflict and back into the region, or just deepen the view that it's pretty much been sidelined here?
Yeah, it's made no difference. I mean, the idea that Putin was going to mediate this was for the birds. I mean, the only person who's going to mediate this, as he proved, was Donald Trump. And so he did. And that's the difference between real power and imaginary power. The Russians have imaginary power in the Middle East. The Americans have got real power.
And there was a time, though, wasn't there, that Russia, or perhaps even going further back, the Soviet Union, really was a player in the Middle East. They had quite an important diplomatic and military role. What happened to that diplomatic and military power?
Well, it atrophied with the collapse of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union was no longer in existence, that whole system of alliances and support structures went into abeyance. The Russians at various times have tried to resurrect it. And the most significant point, of course, was when they jumped into Syria, and basically took over the role the US had tried to do of arbitrate things. And the Russians were very clever, but spotted a big opportunity to insert themselves and stop Assad's regime from falling. And also stop the Americans from engaging, because they saw just a vacuum. But Russia post-Soviet Union has only been able to function when the Americans have given them the space to do so. And Syria is a classic example. The Americans refusing to lead on that meant somebody else could lead on it, and that somebody else turned out to be the Russians. So it's it is interesting how it is space created by a vacuum that enables Russia to insert themselves. And of course, in the last week, there's been no vacuum because it's been fully occupied by Donald Trump. So part of this is when the Americans do get their act together, it is in the contemporary age, it is difficult for Russia, a much weaker power, to do very much. In the old days, correct, Cold War days, and a good example was the end of the Yom Kippur War. The Russians could essentially threaten nuclear warfare if the war didn't stop, and that everyone went, all right, fine, we better stop it in that sort of way. But the Russians lack that kind of power and presence today, and that is reflected in their inability to really do very much when the Americans are taking the lead.
And do you think there is much room at the moment? I mean, with Russia being caught up in a war on its own border in Ukraine, is there much room for Russia to come back at any point and try and reestablish some of its influence in the region?
Well, it'll be difficult right now because, as you pointed out, they are engaged very much so with a war that seems to be never ending of their own, the Ukraine war. It's supposed to be over in a week, and it's we're 3 years in and counting. So the point of this is that they have been they've been very much consumed by that. Their economy is focused towards that and other kind of factors. And until that war is resolved for them, it is very difficult for them to intervene elsewhere, because you do not want to start a two-front war if you're Russia somewhere else when you've got enough problems fighting on the one front. So I think the actual chance of any military intervention is very low of Russia elsewhere. They may try and diplomatically insert themselves, but frankly, they can be ignored quite easily because they lack the sort of the skin in the game, the hard power that would enable their diplomacy to have some heft.
And there will be some concerns you mentioned before about those military systems, Russian military systems that were being used by Iran, especially things like the S-300 air defense system, which didn't really seem to do much, if anything, to stop or halt the Israelis. How are the Russian military going to be feeling about that, do you think?
Well, I think everyone knows that the S-300 is a previous generation's technology. I think that's quite obvious and can't deal with sort of the latest generation of things. There were some suspicions of S-400s, which are, of course, a more up-to-date version. It's unclear exactly whether any of those systems were in use or whether they were knocked out, or if they were in use. Well, I'm not certain of the details there. But I think, in general, what we've seen in the last 3 years is that Russian military equipment is just not up to spec when compared to any Western army. And and you can see that in Ukraine. You can see that in other places where Western armies have been able to deal with Russian-stocked armies elsewhere, militaries elsewhere. And so, if I'm in the Russian defense industry, I'm thinking, right, we're really playing catch up here in this way. What do we have? What capabilities do we have that are going to put us back in front, or give people confidence that if they buy Russian kit, it's going to do what we say it's going to do? And I think that's an interesting challenge for the Russians. They can churn stuff out, but if it isn't effective, if it isn't going to actually lead to successes against Western armies or Western-backed armies, then that's a big problem for a defense industry and for a military that has always projected its ability to actually win wars rather than lose them.
And, we've talked a lot about the diplomatic and military side of this, but there's also the economic importance of this conflict and region for Russia, obviously on oil prices, which, hiked up quite significantly at the start of this conflict, but now seem to have massively dropped, even since Iran's retaliatory strikes on US bases in Qatar, not even before the war ended. It's not really what Russia's economy needs right now for those prices to be coming back down, is it?
No, exactly. And in fact, they didn't even spike that far. They spiked to levels that were within the kind of acceptable parameters of what trading might happen. But yeah, they're basically back down to where they were when the conflict started. And that level of around $60 to $65 a barrel is not what the Russians can afford to sustain their economy on. They do need oil to be higher because that is their main revenue generator. And of course, they're trading at a discount already. Don't forget, they're not being able to sell it on the world market for the price that it's on the world market. They're selling sanctioned oil essentially at a cheaper price. So for them, this is a disaster because, they could have hoped this would have gone on for a long time. They could have hoped that the oil price would spike. They may have deep down wanted the Iranians to block the Straits of Hormuz. That would have been an ideal outcome for them because that would have given their war economy some respite. That's not happened. So as a result, they're back where they were, which is a diminishing sort of economy, a diminishing fund with which they can actually fund their economy with. And there are big questions about what, if the Ukraine war keeps on dragging on, whether the Russians can actually afford to fight it for too long.
And presumably also the Kremlin will have wanted the focus to stay on Iran and Israel and the Middle East and away from the invasion of Ukraine as well, weren't they?
Yes, of course. And what we saw in the 12-day war was basically the Russians trying to launch a number of very aggressive attacks against Ukrainian civilians and others, trying to take advantage of the news cycle to sort of be able to, kind of hide what they're doing in Ukraine, of course. And that's been the case, frankly, since October the 7th. The whole Middle East saga has taken global attention away from Ukraine, which was the issue beforehand. Now it is just one of several issues. And that, of course, does help Putin because it encourages other people to go, well, there's a whole set of conflicts and maybe they're all on the same continuum. And why do we need to worry about Ukraine so much? But and of course, Iran, this little conflict ending has meant that, Gaza is still ongoing. That they'll be hopeful that will take attention away. But I do wonder whether everyone's ready now to refocus on Russia-Ukraine to try and bring that conflict to a halt instead.
And presumably, though, the Kremlin will be at least reasonably happy that attention is not completely back on Ukraine yet. We've seen this NATO summit hasn't really included much discussion of Ukraine. As we're talking, NATO allies have agreed this ironclad commitment to collective defense, but haven't really included any mention of Ukraine in that commitment. That's going to be putting a bit of a smile on Putin's face in the Kremlin, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's come, the NATO summit has just come slightly the wrong time given what's been going on in Iran. But I think in general, it shouldn't put too much of a smile on his face because what the Iranian conflict reminds Europeans, as well as, of course, other NATO members, is that conflict is occurring all over the world now. And as a result, they have to be serious about defense. And whether it is Ukraine, whether it is Iran, whether it is other places, it is quite clear that the 5% target is very necessary. And it will not, Putin will not be smiling if Europe does rearm properly and develops capabilities to resist him. That will be a disaster for him because he was banking on Western weakness, as it were. And if he's faced with Western strength, that's a whole different ballgame when it comes to his future plans.
Well, Dr. Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society, thank you very much for joining me today on the Putin Files.
Thank you for having me.